Hi everyone, my name is Alexis Nank and I am a Community Environmental Management Consultant with Communities Unlimited out of Alabama, and today I will be reviewing a history of the drinking water regulations with you all. Alright, so as I mentioned before, my name is Alexis and I work for Communities Unlimited. We are a partner of the Rural Community Assistance Partnership, and we serve 7 states in the southeast region of the United States. I work in Alabama, but we also cover Mississippi, Tennessee, Louisiana, Arkansas, Oklahoma, and Texas. So before we get started, I just want to give a general overview of what we'll be discussing today. So we'll first discuss some old practices, and then we'll move on to the United States Public Health Services. We will also be discussing the Safe Drinking Water Act and its amendments, the Total Coliform Rule, the Groundwater Rule, Surface Water Treatment Rules, Disinfection Byproducts Rules, and Unregulated Contaminants. And while this may seem kind of mundane, I will try to make this as fun as possible. So, once upon a time, I want to be a little dramatic here, but the truth of it is that drinking water and water in general is needed for all walks of life, all living things, and so it's important to understand where we came from, how we started out, and how we got to where we are today. So we'll first discuss some primitive methods of treating water. So in ancient Sanskrit and Greek writings, there is evidence of 3 different methods of ways they tried to purify their drinking water. The first being filtration. So it would be kind of similar to what you're seeing in this image over here on the right-hand side. These civilizations were pouring water over charcoal to disinfect it. There's also been evidence of them using sun exposure, where they would leave their water out in the sun to not necessarily boil it, but to kind of purify it using the heat from the sun. And also methods of straining to get rid of some of the larger particulates that were found in their water. Jumping forward in time a little bit to the ancient Egyptians, as early as 1500 BC, there's evidence of them using alum to kind of clarify the cloudiness of their water. Moving on to the 1700s, another big jump in time, filtration was established for particle removal, and by the late 1800s, slow stand filtration was being regularly used. Alright, so in the 1800s, we start to see some more advancements in water, and people paying attention to what is in our water matters. So Dr. John Snow in the 1850s, there was a cholera outbreak that was affecting many people that lived there. At the time, people believed that cholera was an airborne disease that was being spread from close contact. In London, many people lived right on top of each other, and the streets were disgusting, and it's easy to see how they believed that this disease was being transmitted through the air. But Dr. John Snow believed otherwise. So he did some research by conducting interviews of people that lived in this specific neighborhood to try and get a better understanding of what was making these people sick, because again, he didn't believe that it was coming from the air. So in these interviews, he was asking people where their water was coming from. And he created this map over here on the left-hand side, where he plotted the deaths and the sick in this specific area, and was able to determine that the majority of these victims had all drunk water from the same well that came from the Broad Street pump. And so After conducting his research and determining that, this has surely got to be what is making all these people sick, he took his research to local authorities, and they removed the handle from the pump, and the cases began to decline. And this was a big step in proving that cholera was a waterborne disease and not an airborne disease. All right, so fast forward a little bit in time, and now we're in the 1900s, early 1900s, and we see the formation of the United States Public Health Service. So this group entity created these regulations and began to introduce the concept of maximum contaminant limits. We, at this point, have begun to realize that drinking water needs to be more a regulated thing, and so they set standards for the bacteriological quality of drinking water. In doing so, they saw rapid declines in cholera and typhoid cases, and these standards were revised and expanded in 1925, 1946, and 1962. But at this point in time, these regulations were very limited as they only applied to the traveling public, meaning that they were really just for interstate carriers like ships and trains. They were not for your standard public water systems like we think of today that serve like communities and such. And so the drinking water standards, which were the final amendment of the U.S. Public Health Services, were effective in April 5th of 1962. These were the most comprehensive federal regulations that we have thus far. This amendment noted concern for the pollution of water supplies and recommended that actions be taken to minimize concentrations of chemicals in drinking water. It also addressed the development of a mechanism to be established for the regular appraisal and regulation of the standards. So we also see that at this time, regulations are expanding from those interstate carriers before the ships and trains, and it's now being enforced for all public water systems. They've added new chemicals to test for and monitor. They've also added regulations for radioactivity. And at this point, we're kind of figuring out that there needs to be more studies conducted so that we have a better understanding of the different things in our water and how it affects our health. So a survey was conducted in 1969, so 7 years after this amendment, and in that study, they surveyed these public water systems, and of the systems that were surveyed, only about 60% of those water systems were meeting the federal guidelines. And of those 60%, more than half had notes of deficiencies for disinfection, clarification, and pressure, which, as we know today, are big no-nos. These can make people very sick. But at the time, it just was not, the information was not there for people to understand and grasp the implications this could have on public health. So shortly after that study in 1969, and actually July of 1970, President Nixon signed the Reorganization Plan Number 3, which called for the establishment of the Environmental Protection Agency, who, as we know now, as kind of the overseer of all of our standards at their basis. So in December 16th of 1974, we have the passing of the Safe Drinking Water Act. The purpose of this was to protect public health by regulating the nation's drinking water supply. We're slowly gathering more information on again, those implications of knowing what's in our water and limiting certain chemicals and contaminants that can have those adverse health effects. And so they've also decided to be more stringent and kind of categorize what these different public water systems are and who these regulations apply to. And so these regulations were meant to be applied to any privately and publicly owned water system that had a minimum of 15 connections or was regularly serving a minimum of 25 people. And at this point, we're focusing on treatment. And so the EPA at this point is considering regulation for contaminants if they fall into three categories. One, does the contaminant have any adverse health effects? Two, is there a substantial likelihood that the contaminant will occur at levels of public health concern in these public water systems? And then three, will regulating these contaminants result in reduced public health risk? And so in this Act, it also sets that while the EPA sets the national standards, the states are the enforcers, and the states also have the authority to make the standards more stringent, which is why we see today that one state may have a certain qualification while one may be completely different. And that's also why you'll notice today that I may not give specific MCLs or things of that nature, just because I know they do vary state by state and I don't want to cause any confusion. So if you notice that today, that is why. So the Safe Drinking Water Act was amended twice. The first time was in 1986. In this amendment, we set standards for new contaminants. Systems at this point are being required to regulate for 80 plus contaminants, and 25 more are added to their list to be required for monitoring by 1991. This is also the point in time where we see the banning of lead service lines. All public water systems were required to provide public notice of the recipients of water being provided through service lines that were potentially contaminated with lead within 2 years of this amendment, which I know today we're still talking about lead service lines, and there's a big push to get rid of all lead service lines. I think by 2037 is the deadline, so soon lead service lines will be a thing of the past, and a thing that we don't even necessarily think of anymore. This amendment also brought about the uncontaminated regulation rule, which we'll discuss a little more later, so I won't get into it too much now. Essentially, though, this required the EPA to, every 5 years, consider a list of contaminants to assess, to potentially monitor in the future. At this point in time, this amendment also made regulations for different disinfection and filtration requirements. You also see source water demonstration programs and wellhead protection plans so that we know how to keep our water safe. In this amendment, it was also noted that Native American tribes were also required to comply with these regulations. And this is the first time we really hear about public notices. And in this amendment, it states that for any serious violations, notices had to be provided within 14 days of receiving the violations. So the Second Amendment occurred in 1996. And so at this point, we're changing the focus of protecting water at the tap to protecting water at the source. So this amendment included specifications for source water protection, in which it required every state to assess the sources of its drinking water to identify any significant potential sources of contamination, and then also determine how susceptible those sources are to those threats. You also see consumer confidence reports come out of this amendment. At this point, we have this big emphasis that consumers have the right to know what's in their drinking water, where it comes from, how it's treated, and how it's being protected. Operator training is also included in this amendment. This amendment states that operators must be certified. And the guidelines for those specifications for certification and recertification were released a couple of years later in 1999. This is also when we see microbial contaminants and disinfection byproducts be discussed for the first time. So the EPA required a push to protect from microbial contaminants like cryptosporidium. Well, we also wanted to control the byproducts of that disinfection, which we'll talk about later in the disinfection byproducts rules. And then it also discussed funding for improvements, which is where you see the creation of the Drinking Water State Revolving Fund to ensure that everyone can provide necessary improvements for their system to continue to provide safe drinking water to their customers and consumers. So let's get into some of more specific rules. Now we're going to shift and talk about the total coliform rules. So the total coliform rule was in 1989, and total coliform itself is not a direct health risk, but it is an indicator of potential contamination of harmful pathogens such as E. coli. So this rule set maximum contaminant level goals and maximum contaminant levels for the presence of total coliforms in drinking water. The intention was to protect public health by ensuring the integrity of drinking water throughout the distribution system. And the monitoring frequency for this rule was determined by the number of people the public water system served. So there were routine sampling requirements for this. It required that samples must be collected from sites that are representative of the system as a whole and must be in a written plan to ensure that they're pulling from the same or similar sites consistently. This also included that they must be collected at regular time intervals throughout the month. Those requirements are again based on the population served. Excuse me, sorry. This also required that each total coliform positive sample must be tested for the presence of fecal coliforms or E. coli. If any routine sample is determined to be positive, repeat samples are required. So when you conduct repeat sampling, it must occur within 24 hours of learning of the positive routine sample, and you have to take the repeat sample at the same source of the positive sample, and then also at 5 service connections upstream and 5 service connections downstream to get a better understanding of how widespread the positive contaminant is in the system. There's also additional routine sampling, which is when a positive routine or repeat result occurs. You are required to take a minimum of 5 routine samples the following month unless it's waived by your primacy. And so this rule, like many others we'll see today and have already seen, was revised in 2013. At this point, they set a maximum contaminant level for E. coli. So the maximum contaminant level and the contaminant level goal are set to 0 because even at low levels, we've seen that outbreaks can occur, and there is no safe level of E. coli in drinking water. The revision of this rule also added in assessments and corrective actions for vulnerable systems. So if you do have positive samples, you could end up having to do a level 1 or a level 2 assessment. A level 1 assessment is triggered by your system receiving too many total coliform positive routine samples. So for larger systems that are taking more than 40 samples, if they have greater than 5% of those samples come back as positive, or for smaller systems that are taking less than those 40 samples, have more than 2 positive samples, that could cause a level 1 assessment to have to be performed, or if the system fails to take every required repeat sample after a total coliform positive. And so after a level 1 assessment is a level 2 assessment where your system may incur an E. coli MCL violation. And so if your system has had 2 level 1 assessments in a 12-month rolling period, that can also trigger a level 2 assessment. Any system on state-approved annual monitoring that has a level 1 assessment trigger in 2 consecutive years will also have to conduct a level 2 assessment. This revision also included public notifications for violations, especially with the seriousness of, how sick E. coli can make people. And so they even went as far as to provide specific language for the consumer confidence reports after incurring violations to ensure that it's clearly stated that if you have received one of these violations, it is clearly stated in that end of year report. It's also noted in here that all deficiencies must have swift corrective actions. They typically prefer that they happen as soon as possible, but no later than 30 days. This revision also included requirements for seasonal systems that don't run year-round, to include that they needed to perform startup procedures like disinfection, flushing, maybe a site visit from the premises, and sampling for total coliform and E. coli before they are able to provide water to consumers. So now we're moving on to the groundwater rule, which was passed in 2006. This rule was intended to reduce disease incidents associated with harmful microorganisms in drinking water. Groundwater systems are more susceptible to fecal contamination, and so the goal of this rule was to identify systems that were susceptible to fecal contamination and required corrective actions to be taken to correct any significant deficiencies to prevent that source water fecal contamination. And so there's compliance monitoring, and you could forego compliance monitoring if you provided for-log treatment. And for-log treatment just means that you reduce viruses by 99.99% through methods like disinfection, membrane filtration, or ultraviolet light. There was also triggered source water monitoring. So if a system does not conduct compliance monitoring and a total coliform positive were to come back from a sample that's collected, the system must conduct the triggered source water monitoring. Excuse me. With that triggered monitoring, the system must collect at least one groundwater source sample from each source in use at time of the positive result. If the triggered samples were also positive, the system must take corrective action or conduct additional source water sampling. Additional source water sampling usually occurs when the state primacy doesn't require the corrective actions, and then the system must collect 5 additional source water samples from the same source within 24 hours of that positive notification. Okay, so now we're going to move on to the surface water treatment rules. So here's kind of an overview of what makes up the surface water treatment rules. There's the original rule that came about in 1989, which required that most systems needed to filter and disinfect water from surface water or groundwater under the direct influence of surface water. It also set maximum contaminant levels for viruses, bacteria, and giardia. It required treatment techniques for filtered and unfiltered systems. Then in 1998, we have the Interim Enhanced Surface Water Treatment Rule. Say that 5 times fast. And so this required that, or really applied to systems that were surface water, groundwater under the direct influence of surface water that were serving 10,000 or more people. It required watershed protection programs that needed to address cryptosporidium for systems that were not required to provide filtration. This rule also set the maximum contaminant level goal of 0 for cryptosporidium, because just like E. coli, there's not really a safe level. And it also required that sanitary surveys be conducted for all surface water systems, regardless of their size. In 2001, we see the filter backwash recycling rule. This required public water systems to review their backwash water recycling practices to ensure they're not compromising microbial control. Recycled filter backwash water was to go through all processes of a system's conventional or direct filtration treatment. And then in 2002, we get the long-term 1 enhanced surface water treatment rule. This was similar to the interim enhanced surface water treatment rule, but was geared for those public water systems that were serving a population of less than 10,000 people. And then the long-term 2 enhanced surface water treatment rule of 2006 just added additional treatment requirements for cryptosporidium for higher risk systems. Okay, so I kind of just want to stop here and talk about why these rules are important. I feel like sometimes the importance can kind of get lost in the monotony of the rules. Especially for operators. The role that you're in is so imperative because you really are. You control the drinking water that we all consume, that we cook with, we drink, we give to our children, everyone. And so sometimes it's important to take a step back and look at the why. And so for these surface water treatment rules, the importance is cryptosporidosis prevention. Symptoms of this disease cause profuse watery diarrhea, stomach cramps or pain, nausea and vomiting, fever, headache, loss of appetite, dehydration, lots of horrible things. In healthy people, these symptoms can last 1 to 2 weeks, or as long as 30 days. And for anyone who is immunocompromised, that can be much, much longer and more severe. And so, if we can just, abide by these responsibles and do our part to ensure safe drinking water, we can save a lot of people a lot of pain. And the reason I bring that up, and so the reason I kind of brought that to your attention is because there have been outbreaks of cryptosporidosis. And the first recognized outbreak was in Bronze Station, Texas in 1984. And I don't know if you caught that date, but 1984, and the first surface water treatment rule was passed in 1989. So before this outbreak, cryptosporidium and cryptosporidosis was not widely recognized as a waterborne pathogen in humans. And so in this outbreak, more than 2,000 residents were affected and had all those terrible, awful symptoms. And so the first rule was passed in 1989, and from 1986 to 1988, there were about 50 more outbreaks reported by state and local health departments that were caused from contaminated drinking water. And then again, we see this major outbreak in Milwaukee, Wisconsin in 1993, where 403,000 people were estimated to be affected. And to kind of put that in perspective, at this point in time, Milwaukee's population was approximately 1.25 million people, so a third of that area affected with cryptosporidosis. Could not imagine. And that's why, again, we have these rules in place, because throughout time we have learned, there's been research conducted, and we know the potential of these contaminants and viruses and pathogens and all the things, and we know how to combat those and make our drinking water safe. Okay, so now we'll move on to disinfection byproducts, because while disinfection does help prevent some of these pathogens and such, there can also be some downsides to it. So before we get too much into the rule, I wanted to kind of show this graphic to kind of explain further what a disinfection byproduct is. So when chlorine and other disinfectants react with organic matter in the water, leaves, algae, things of that nature, they form TCHMs, or trihalomethanes, and HAA5s, or haloacetic acids. And so now we'll get on to the rules. So the Stage 1 disinfection byproduct rule required compliance for all systems by 2004, and the goal of this rule was to reduce exposure to disinfection byproducts. It established 7 new standards for total trihalomethanes, haloacetic acids, bromate, chlorite and chloramines, chlorine dioxide, and disinfection byproduct precursors. It also added new treatment techniques for enhanced coagulation or enhanced softening, and then the frequencies of these again varied by the size of the system, as we've seen with some of these other rules. And so we also have the Stage 2 disinfection byproduct rule, and this took the rules from Stage 1 and made them more stringent. So this required systems to complete initial distribution system evaluations to characterize the different disinfection byproduct levels in their distribution system and identify locations to monitor for compliance. In this rule, excuse me, the locational running annual average came about, and so in order to conduct a locational running annual average, you will take all the sample results for a specific contaminant, whichever of those 7 it may be, from a single monitoring site within a calendar quarter. You will then calculate the average of results for that quarter, and repeat that process for the previous 3 quarters. After you have 4 averages, you calculate the average of those 4 averages, and that's your locational running annual average. This is done for each monitoring location, for each contaminant being monitored. So, a lot of math. There's also operational evaluation levels in instances of exceedances for those locational running annual averages. I do want to point out, though, that exceedances can occur more frequently during warm months, when water has been in the distribution system for extended periods of time, if higher quantities of disinfectant are used in the instance of like line breaks, or if you've had to do a bit of flushing, or if you just know that a threat is in your water and you have pushed some extra disinfectant to kind of combat that. It can also happen after heavy rainfall events, when there's more potential for organic matter to be present in your water. And so, again, kind of like a why it matters moment. Chronic exposure to high levels of these disinfection byproducts has been linked to liver, kidney, and central nervous system issues. So again, it's one of those things where we're protecting public health by abiding by these maximum contaminant levels and ensuring that we don't have exceedances of these chemicals. So now I want to discuss those unregulated contaminants that we kind of discussed earlier. So this rule was created to ensure that adequate contamination regulations were, continuing to be created. Because as we've seen through time, we've continuously learned about new public health concerns of things in our drinking water, and so every 5 years the EPA announces new unregulated contaminants to be monitored and make regulatory determinations regarding at minimum 5 contaminants that were on that list. And so in that 5-year period, the first year is for preparations, and then years 2 to 4 are for sample collection, and then that 5th year is for the data reporting. Assessment monitoring and screening surveys are also required to assess concentrations of chemicals and contaminants. And so we'll get into these different rounds of testing for unregulated contaminants. So UCMR 1, or the first round of this unregulated contaminant monitoring, tested for 11 contaminants that were herbicides and insecticides and some explosive additives. It also addressed 12 chemicals and aeromonas. And this round of testing took place between 2001 and 2005. Round 2 took place from 2007 to 2006 to 2011, and tested for 10, again, unregulated contaminants and 15 chemicals, which included pesticides, flame retardants, explosives, and disinfection byproducts. Round 3 was from 2012 to 2017, I believe. My math's adding up correctly. It addressed 7 contaminants, 5 of which were hormones that were naturally produced by humans, 1 synthetic steroid, and 1 hormone that was derived from horses. It also had systems monitor for 21 chemicals, which included halogenated alkane, chromium, cobalt, and 6 variations of PFAS. And then it also had systems collect samples to test for 2 different viruses, which were the enterovirus and the norovirus. Also included were other naturally occurring metals and a few other volatile organic compounds. In that 4th round, we tested for 30 chemical contaminants, which included cyanotoxins, metals, pesticides, alcohols, disinfection byproducts again, and semi-volatile organic chemicals. The 5th and most recent round of uncontaminated monitoring was for 30 contaminants, which were 29 variants of PFAS and lithium. And I bet you can't guess what my next slide is going to be about. Alright, so from that 5th round of testing for unregulated contaminants, we found that PFAS, or per and polyfluoroalkyl substances, was something that needed to have regulations created for. And so, with this being kind of a newer thing, and one of the newest monitoring requirements, I wanted to give a little background about it. So where did it come from? PFAS is a compound that is very commonly found. It is in food packaging, those grease-resistant papers, like candy wrappers, microwave popcorn bags, pizza boxes, things of that nature. It's also found in fire extinguishing foam. It's in consumer products, like anything that's non-stick or is water or stain repellent. And because it's so prevalent in consumer goods, it has also been found in food that's caught in contaminated water, because as a society, pollution is a thing, and even in like landfills and things like that, those chemicals like leach and they can get into groundwater, and so it's also found in our drinking water, as we've seen. And so back again to why does that matter? So PFAS has been linked to some severe adverse health effects. It's been linked to cancers, prostate, kidney, and testicular cancers. It has also shown increased levels of cholesterol and risk of obesity in people who had PFAS in their system, as well as decreased fertility in women. And so these are things that gave the justification to make this a regulated contaminant. And so initial sampling requirements have come out, and I believe that everyone is required to have that initial sampling done by 2027, which is right around the corner. Any groundwater community system, non-transient, non-community water system that's serving more than 10,000 persons, and all surface water and groundwater under the direct influence systems are being required to take 4 samples that are 2 to 4 months apart within a 12-month period, ensuring that all quarterly periods are represented. And for those smaller systems, those groundwater community and non-transient, non-community water systems that serve less than 10,000 people are being required to take 2 samples that are 5 to 7 months apart within a 12-month period. If your system happens to have a blended source, the requirements for your sampling should be based on the most restrictive source, as well as the total population that's served by the system. And so, again, why does it matter? Whether you're, a clerk or a chairman or an operator or anyone in this, profession, Our job is to protect the public health by providing customers with clean, safe drinking water. And PFAS has been, as I mentioned before, linked to some severe health problems. And so, although this new sampling requirement may seem like another thing added to your already busy schedules, by conducting these initial samples, we can begin to determine the extent of contamination, and in turn develop measures to reduce exposure. And maybe one day PFAS will be a thing of the past. Who knows? But as we continue to conduct research and learn about things in our environment and how they affect our water and our health, more rules will come about. Yeah. So that concludes the information that I have for you all today. I know this is not necessarily all of the rules and regulations in the drinking water world, but for time constraints, I included some of the ones that I considered to be a little more imperative. But thank you for being here today. Operators and clerks and chairmen and everyone in this water world has such an important job, and thank you for taking the time to take this refresher and keep ensuring clean, safe drinking water for your consumers. So again, thank you for attending this presentation. One last time, I'm Alexis, and if you have any needs in Alabama or in the southern region of the United States, feel free to reach out to me via my email or my phone number, and we will be happy to give you some assistance.